Welcome back to Module 3 of HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. I'm Cullen, and we're going to go ahead and get started right now with building the user interface by using HTML5 with a special focus on organization, input, and form validation. Good times. Let's get going. All right, so we're going to talk first about semantic HTML, some new tags used in HTML5. We're going to talk about how to create tables and lists. Then we're going to focus on input and forms, and finally form validation, making sure that when people input information in forms, it's valid or correct, right? Super important stuff for building web pages. All right, on to semantic HTML. HTML5 has introduced several new elements for organizing content and forms on web pages. We've got some new tags, and you'll see in the image to the right, we've got a header tag, a nav tag, which stands for navigation, a section tag, an article tag for articles like you'd find in a newspaper, an aside, sort of like an aside conversation that we may very well have during today's presentation, and then a footer for content like copyrights, published dates, all those kinds of things, right? These tags are all part of semantic markup or semantic HTML. Semantic actually just means meaning, and doesn't get much more meaningful than that, I guess. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on. Let's focus on what this looks like, right? So the semantic markup ensures that tag names match with the function that a tag performs. So, you know, a footer tag is used to create a footer, and so on. In HTML4, it used to be the case that we'd use div tags for everything, and div is just short for division. And so we'd have to use the ID attribute in order to label what it was, right? So if it was a footer, we'd have to use ID footer, and I'll just go ahead and highlight that here for you. So right here, we'd have to do something like that. Notice the difference. Up here, there's less typing. Down here, there is more typing. Unfortunately, my writing's not very good, but that does say more, I promise you. All right, so let's talk about the div tag and how it would have been used, right? So if you guys recall from last module, I had that picture of my dog, Stella, right? The div tag typically requires the use of class or ID attributes. So class and ID are global attributes which can be applied to any HTML element. Class is used to identify a group of elements, or like, I think of it like a class of students. So if you're all in the same class, you'd be like in Mr. White's AP Computer Science class. That would be a class, right? And then an ID would be like your student number or your name, right? Like Morgan, something along those lines. Here in this example, right, notice that this div, I've identified it as an about section. And then I have a nested div inside, which is about Stella. And then finally, I've got a slogan right here that says happy dogs are good dogs. So maybe I'm talking about a business that I'm starting with my dog. She's a dog model, right? You guys saw that last photo. She's awesome. Let's go ahead and take a look at what this actually looks like. So if you're typing code in an editor, in HTML5, it's so much simpler and cleaner than it would have been in HTML4. Instead of seeing all those div elements and then having to go through all the different IDs, now you can just go ahead and find a section of code and know exactly what its function is. And that's what's so beautiful about semantic markup. It's really clean, it's really neat, it's really orderly, and it's super easy to read, not just for you, but also for the people who might be reading your code someday. Who knows, there might be some folks that are learning based off of your web pages. So let's talk about all these different structural tags, right? We've got header and footer, which you guys saw last time. We saw nav, we saw section, and then we also saw aside and article. Address is another one that you can use. You have details. Then you also have H group, which actually groups different headers like your H1, H2, H3 elements, multi-level headings. And finally, you have summary too, right? Which is going to, guess what? be the place where the summary goes. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what these tags are supposed to do, unless, of course, you never read a newspaper article. But that's another video. Anyway, header and footer elements. Let's go ahead and take a look at these in action, right? I don't want to spend too much time, so forgive me if I go too fast. I just think that these things are relatively obvious, and you can always download these slides as well to go ahead and review them later. Your header element is going to define the header. So note it here that it doesn't have to be for a web page. It could actually be for an article, right? And then you've got a footer as well for the same article. That just includes the publish date, right? And here, notice we used the time tag for the publish date, another semantic markup element, which I think is super cool. It makes it really easy for people to know that that's the time or where the time goes. Next, let's talk about the section element, right? It defines just sections of a page. So if you have a left section, a middle section, and a right section, can be definitely used to identify those things. But sometimes it's not always an appropriate thing to use. If we have content that's separate from other content on the page, then we want to use the article tag, right? You could also use the aside tag as well, right? So let's say that you're creating a web page that has something to do with your family vacation. Maybe you're going to Pacific Grove, California. That's where some of my family lives. And you want to do a quick little feature on Pacific Grove. Well, instead of using the section element, you'd want to go ahead and use the aside element. So keep things like that in mind. If you want to create a sidebar, once again, use the aside element. If you want to go ahead and wrap and position multiple sections that aren't related to each other, if you want to group them, you'd still want to use a div tag, which is super, super helpful. If you want to do something like add a drop shadow or style an item, use a div tag as well. It'll make it a little bit easier. You can use the ID property in order to make sure that you apply the style appropriately. All right, so like I had mentioned previously, the H group element simply just groups heading elements. So we have H1 and we have H3 here. You could have all sorts of headers all grouped together. Here, this one is just sort of the H1 element is your main heading. And then this H3 is something we call a subheading. And I'm trying to write it on the screen for you, but it is not working very well. I do actually write like that with an ink pen too. I know you guys are amazed, but that's how it goes. Something that's important to understand about the H group element is that it's really just for structure. It's not going to affect the way that anything appears on the screen. So if we went ahead and we took this, and we will in just a second in our demo, and we went ahead and opened it up in Internet Explorer, we would see that nothing would look any different than if we never had the H group element there at all. So, all right, next, the nav element. It's used to organize links that allow users to navigate from one page to another. I know that very rarely do you visit a web page and not have multiple links on a page or multiple pages that you would visit. And so the nav tag is absolutely crucial if you're building a web page, right? And finally, just go ahead and we'll revisit the article and aside elements really quickly. I wanted to bring back this visual so that you could see how aside could be laid out in HTML. And then article, you'd have a couple of articles in a section of text very easily, right? It's really important that you guys know that these semantic elements, they don't change how content appears on the page. That's actually done with CSS. So also, if you want to change the placement of an element, you have to make sure that you're using cascading style sheets. And we'll talk about that in our upcoming modules here, okay? So let's take a quick second to go ahead and do a quick demo so that you guys can see all of these things in action. So here we have our semantic demo. I'll just open this up real quickly for you. Notice that we've got our navigation element that we just saw and a couple slides back, and then here we have an article. The reason why I wanted you guys to see this page is so that you can understand that these elements, they don't just make something appear like this, right? Like this image on the right. There's a lot of extra work that has to go into making a web page appear the way that it does. And so it's super, super important that you don't just make the assumption that these semantic elements just structure a page and make it appear the way you want it to, okay? So let's go back, go back to Web Matrix here, and I'm gonna go ahead and right click my HTML document, launch in the browser, and there we go, right? Everything is just line after line after line. Note here that our H group element doesn't impact the way that things look on a page at all. Looks just the way that it would if it was never there. But I know that those belong as a group. All right. Okay, let's transition. Let's talk about tables and lists really fast, super fast, in fact, okay? All right, so if you're creating a table, you're gonna wanna use the table tag, another semantic markup, right? You use a combination of all of these other tags in order to add your rows, your columns, and everything else. Use the TR tag to create a table row. That's what TR stands for. You have the TH tag is table header. It's gonna create headers. TD tag, I'm still trying to figure out what D means, so if anybody knows, go ahead and definitely send me an email or follow me on Twitter. It's always a good thing to do. Next, if you want to style columns in a particular way, you can go ahead and group them together using the call group element. And then, of course, we have different ways to mark groups of headers, header rows, footer rows, you know, the body, and then also providing a caption. I'll show you how to use a couple of those things here in just a second. So let's take a look at what this code looks like in a browser. So bear with me as we go back to Web Matrix and open up Table Demo. All right, so note here that I've got a caption. Maybe I'm working on my graduate thesis in addition to working 3 full-time jobs, and I really want to make sure that I'm keeping track of all the hours that I'm working. Well, here I've got a table with a border, so I'm using the border attribute of 1 in order to make sure that we outline our table. And then I've just got the first row, which is going to be the header with month and hours. Then I have the second row, which is going to be April, which is the month, right? Notice how those match up. Then 100 is the number of hours that I worked. And I've got my third row here for June. So I clearly did a lot of work in April, not very much work in June because it's beautiful and sunny outside, like 80 degrees. And then in July, I've got to buckle back down because, well, it's going to be due in August or something along those lines. Anyway, let's go ahead and pop that demo into our browser, and you see how that table is formatted there, right? So pretty cool stuff. We got our caption up top, number of hours worked on the thesis. Let me snap that over here. And then we have the month and the hours. Pretty self-explanatory, but tables can be confusing to work with, so if it does take you a little bit longer to figure out, don't be too hard on yourself. It's definitely just sort of harder to read than some of the other markup that we use, okay? So, all right, back to the presentation. Lists. There are 2 different types of lists that we could add into our HTML documents. We've got ordered and unordered. Ordered lists use the OL tag, and they order items in a list using numbers, right? So it's numerical order. So you check out that example on the right of an ordered list of my favorite foods. Number 1 is pizza, and number 2 is cake. It can be a little confusing because you're not going to see 1 and 2 there. You're going to see LI, which stands for line item, or sorry, list item. But do know that it'll appear as number 1 and number 2. That's not actually my favorite food list. I just thought everybody would be able to relate to it a little bit more. All right, next we have an unordered list, okay? UL tag, the UL tag is used to display items in a bulleted list. You know, once again, we add items to that list using the list item tag, the LI tag. And so if I'm visiting Seattle, then I have a to-do list, right? I want to make sure that I visit the Space Needle, and I also have to buy a rain jacket because everybody here thinks it rains. It's 80 degrees outside right now. It's nice, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at lists in action in a demo, okay? All right, so let me pull up the list demo. Note here, we've got our two different kinds of lists. Keep that in mind. I'm gonna go ahead and launch here in the browser. And there we go, right? Pizza's number 1, cake's number 2, my Seattle to-do list. I've got Space Needle by Rain Jacket, no particular order. Doesn't matter which one I do it, so therefore I'm gonna use bullets. Pretty quick and easy, right? Lists are definitely not too challenging or too confusing. Still can be a little tricky though. All right, let's go ahead and transition and take a look at input and forms. A web form is a page that features input fields where users enter data. Form input, or that data that's supplied by users, is sent to a server where it's processed and stored. And we use these forms everything. They're super ubiquitous. They're all over the place. We use them to sign up for newsletters, to complete surveys, to make purchases and enter our credit card information. I mean, they legitimately are in almost everything that we do. Every single time that we enter in a username, like our login credentials, we're using a form. Super important, right? There's a graphic on the right there of a form, just in case you've never seen one before. But if you haven't, you're probably lying to us and yourself, more importantly. All right, so if you want to create a form, guess what? You're going to use the form element, right? There's semantic HTML in action again. We create a form using the form element, and then inside we're going to nest our input and our label tags, right? The label element is going to display a label for each field. So, in our example that we just saw, we had a field for our first name, and we should probably label it so people know what kind of text needs to go in it. We've got the for attribute here so that we know that the label is for the input tag with the name, first name. So notice how these match up. That's super, super, super important, okay? Next, we have our input element here, right? The type is text, which means that people are gonna go ahead and type in text. It's just gonna be a blank field that doesn't have anything in it. And similarly, we're gonna use the same style for our last name input box, and then also our email input box. Notice here though that for first name and last name, we've got text and text. And then for, pardon me here. All right, then for our email box, we're gonna use a different type. It's gonna say email. It's for a particular reason, which we'll get at in just a second. So there are a lot of different types of input, right? So we just saw email and we saw text, but you could also, make the value of type. You could set it as password, right, for passwords. Set it as submit to create a submit button. We could set it as radio for a radio button, checkbox for checkboxes, dates for dates, like today, which is June 22nd, 2015. And we could also add it as a search field. And a search field is going to be very similar to a text box. People are going to be able to type in text that they want to search for, right? I love semantic HTML. It makes teaching so much easier. All right. There are a couple of other different attributes that we want to be able to use with our input elements. We're going to use the autofocus element, or autofocus attribute, the required attribute, and then the placeholder attribute, okay? Autofocus is going to bring focus to a specific element. So if you have a form on a web page, it's going to highlight it, right? So if you have a box here, it's going to go ahead and it's going to highlight it in some kind of blue hue behind it in order to say, start with me, I want you to go ahead and enter information here. Required is going to make sure that people enter it. So they go to submit a form, they're going to get a little pop-up box that says, hey, you have to enter something here. We'll go ahead and see what that looks like in just a little bit, okay? And then finally, a placeholder. A placeholder is pretty cool because you can go ahead and insert, I guess what I call dummy text. so that users know what they should be entering and where they should be entering it. I typically use a placeholder in combination with, I'll actually go show you here, with a label, because if I don't, I'm still just always concerned that people aren't going to necessarily know where to go or whether something's going to not render properly. And so it's better to be safe than sorry, unless of course you're going for a very specific style on your web page. All right, let's take a look at this web form demo here, okay? So note the use of placeholders. You're going to see those in action, and I'll sort of show you what we can do with autofocus as well. So let's go ahead and go over to Web Matrix. I'm going to pull up our forms demo, and let's go ahead and take a look at it in the browser first. So it's not very pretty. I'll apologize for that, but do notice here that we have our placeholder text. Here we have the placeholder text set as first name. Let's snap that real quickly here. And you can see that we have placeholder text set as last name, email address, and then also password. If I enter in a password here, like I love Web Matrix, notice that you weren't able to see me entering my password. I can go ahead and set it as visible. And of course, I spelled everything correctly, which is awesome. But here we hide all the characters that are entered inside of a password field. All right. Let's take a look and see what happens if we add in the required field. I'm going to expand this real quickly here. What happens if, let's see, let's say that a first name is required. I'm going to go ahead and save the file, snap it back here real fast. Let's go ahead and refresh this page. So if I enter my last name, White, col.something at example.com, and then I enter in a password. My password here is stuff. Not a good password, by the way. And I go ahead and click submit. Oh, look at that. It says it's a required field and it is highlighted in red. Pretty nifty stuff, right? Pretty nifty stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and head back to our presentation here. We saw everything in action. I want to double check and make sure we touched on everything. Oh, I want to show you autofocus too. I feel like a horrible human being if I didn't show you that. Not really, but I just feel like I should show you that. It's pretty important stuff. Bring that back up. So let's say that we are filling out a form and we want, let's see here, we've got our first name field. We don't only want to make that required, but we want to go ahead and set this to autofocus, okay? So we set it to autofocus. We'll set it equal to whoops. Set it to true. Sorry there. Another thing that's really important to keep in mind, guys and gals, is that you're going to make a lot of mistakes. I make tons and tons of mistakes, especially when you're starting out. Nobody's perfect. And so that's the first thing that I tell all my students. Like, if you make a mistake, it just means that you get to learn more, which is pretty cool. It's the best way to learn, in fact. Unless, of course, you know, you break an arm or something like that. That'd be pretty bad. Let's go ahead and save this file. Make sure it's saved. Gonna go ahead and refresh. And now if I refresh the page, autofocus, it didn't give me that hue that I was talking about, and that might be different based on the browser that I'm using. But what it did do is when I land on the page, it's gonna go ahead and it's gonna place my cursor immediately inside of first name. And if you actually see there where I'm hovering over with the cursor, that's pretty cool. It said this is a required field, right? No asterisks, nothing like that, but definitely some cool stuff with HTML5 and forms. Okay. All right. Let's talk about form validation. You actually already have seen this in action. So validation is a process of verifying that information obtained from a form is in the appropriate format. So sometimes we have issues like an empty field, right? I didn't enter my first name last time. You might have an invalid date, an invalid email address. Maybe you're supposed to enter a telephone number. We've got to make sure that people are actually doing that when they enter their information on forms. With HTML5, we can make this automatic, but in HTML4, it wasn't automatic, right? So here we can do something like this with HTML5 where we say, please provide a valid email address when somebody tries to click this submit button. Now, the type of validation that occurs with HTML5 is called client-side validation. So it happens inside the browser. So it's not going to happen after information has been sent to a server somewhere in California, maybe Redmond, Washington, wherever servers happen to be located. If a user enters the wrong value into a form field, we also want to make sure that the browser instructs them to correct the error. So notice it's not just saying, please provide a valid email address in the little pop-up on the right, or not just provide an email address, but rather saying provide a valid email address. And so here we have Jane@live, and maybe that's supposed to be .com or .org, but we can set up a form so that people actually have to enter proper email addresses or telephone numbers. And you do this with the pattern attribute. And the pattern attribute can be pretty complex, but I strongly suggest you go ahead and take a look at Bing. Just do a quick search for HTML forms pattern attribute. You can find a lot of really great information and some tutorials that are available to figure out how to utilize that in order to perform client-side validation. All right, so it's the end of our Module 3 journey. Just as a quick recap, we discussed semantic HTML. We reviewed tables and lists, how to create both. We talked about how to create forms and how to handle different types of input. Super important, those types. And finally, we talked a little bit about form validation and what happens on the client side. We'll talk a little bit later about how to perform form validation with JavaScript, but that's a little bit later in Module 9 or something along those lines. I don't know, but thanks again for joining me. Hope you had a good time. We'll see you next in Module 4. Bye.